Welcome back, everyone. We're continuing into our fourth lesson and video on the sculptural tradition in ancient India, and also now moving into the sculptural traditions in Hinduism. We left together in our last video with just a peek at the Chola dynasty, having completed our discussion of the Gupta Empire. So let us move right to the Chola dynasty and continue our exploration into the form, the ritual and artistic development of the form of Hindu sculpture. All right, here we are. So the Chola dynasty, also sometimes spelled Kola, is in South India. Here you see it in pink, and we're looking here at its period of from 848 to 1279 that we understand it to be the Chola dynasty. However, we know that the Cholas themselves are date back as a formidable family and warriors to a much earlier period of unknown antiquity. So you'll find claims of being the longest dynasty in the world and various discussions about that. But for our purposes, we're looking at the period from 848 to 1279, though we do have evidence of poems and Indian Tamil rulers of unknown antiquity around 200 CE. So conceivably, we could trace this to a much older period. So it's not that important about the dates, but I like to learn by having a sense of where movements are. What you're looking at here on the right is a sculpture that we will soon be focusing on. It is Shiva as Lord of the Dance, which is distinct to South India and Chola. It developed in Chola, this particular form of Shiva. I hope I didn't say Vishnu a moment ago, Shiva. So we will talk at length about what we're looking at here, but first let me quickly discuss a bit more about Chola. So the Chola Empire at 1030 CE should be clear. You see here in the lavender its territory, which extends up into near Kalinga and into parts of Sri Lanka. Its influence extends into Southeast Asia, as you can see here, the Nongkar Islands, the Malaysia, Indonesia, and you can't, I don't know why that happened or why we ended up there. But in any case, the Chola Empire here extends into Southeast Asia. And do keep this in mind, because our page that focuses on the fusion or the introduction of Hinduism, Buddhism, into and ultimately the Muslim faith into Indonesia, we can understand that the Chola dynasty had a very important role in bringing Hinduism into, and its particular manifestation aesthetically and ritually, Hinduism into Indonesia and Malaysia. So I'll just leave it at that. I remind you in your reading, that the northern Indian temples have much more curved temple forms of the womb, the sacred womb of the temple. You might remember that from your reading. You can recognize a South Indian temple, as your reading explains, with these angular forms. They're no longer curved. So that's an architectural distinction. And then the development of we can only look at the Shiva, Lord of Dance, as an example of the sculptural tradition, but it is one of the most well-known Hindu images, and there are many, many versions of it, and it's quite popular since its inception and continuing today. Okay, so what I just did in the last 4 lectures is laid out the historical kind of groundwork to where to place different sculptural movements and different places in India, because we're going to leave India in our next module and go to China. And it's really important for you to have in mind India that has these different dynasties and has these different aesthetic movements, even if we're only scratching the surface of what they look like. It's a starting point. Now we are moving into a different kind of study and attention, which is we're looking now more closely at sculpture and the Hindu gods and how they are depicted and how we can recognize them. But before we do that, I'd like to make one final and important distinction that you should know, and it's mentioned in your Neve Asian art reading, between aniconic and iconic, or aniconic and iconic. And what this simply means is that for a long time we know, for example, during the Maurya Empire, Buddha was not depicted as a historical living man or having any human form at all. It was either considered in tension or in contradiction to his dematerialization through enlightenment and his detachment from his body and the material part of his physical self. Or it could be, there's much debate about this, why he's not represented, or it could simply be that, like other religious traditions, such as in the Abrahamic tradition of Judaism, or certainly the Muslim faith, another Abrahamic religious tradition, the depiction of God is considered beyond human capacity, so it's never done. So it could also be an influencing factor. At any rate, we have alternative ways of depicting a deity in the Hindu faith, and we call it aniconic, and that means when we have a form that tells us who we're looking at without depicting that figure, that's aniconic. So here we have Buddha's footprints carved into stone, and that tells us the negative imprint that Buddha's feet made on the earth is all we have as a trace of him, which is a resonant image because it also evokes pilgrimage and walking, and many Buddhists go on pilgrimages and visit different stupas and different shrines. And so there is that element that is possible to take into account here as well. But let's just focus on what is aniconic. So there is no figure that is Buddha, but we know it's Buddha because we have come to recognize and understand this was the aniconic way of representing Buddha. Very nicely in contrast are the two yaksha or yakshi on each side. These are those nature or fertility deities that were native or indigenous to India and Indian cults that preceded the Indic religion and Vedism, or coexisted with it and did not change. And these were integrated into not only Hinduism, but you saw on the stupa of Sanchi, also in Buddhism as celebratory, gracious attributes to indicate the sacred nature of Buddha, and we see them in Jain temples. So they're in all three of the Indic faiths. So here they are embodied. They are not aniconic. They are iconic in the sense that they are depicted as themselves, as yaksha, as these female nature deities. And Buddha is aniconic, as only the trace of his footprints reveal his body to us in our mind's eye, but not actually. Similarly, something more on a more symbolic level would be the wheel that we see on the stupa of Sanchi, which you should have seen in the videos in your last module. So the wheel here is standing in for Buddha when Buddha's disciples are gathering around him. And so it was understood that this is Buddha, but not represented. That's aniconic. Iconic is when the figure, the deity, is represented. And here we're looking once again at Gandhara, which began our series, these very classicizing Greek-influenced sculptural forms. This is thought to be the earliest representation, or one of the absolute first representations of Buddha, 1st or 2nd century CE in Pakistan, that is near Alexander the Great and the classical tradition, which I spent so much time talking about 2 sessions ago. So this is iconic. It's embodying and articulating an actual form of Buddha. So it becomes an icon, an iconic figure. And it's in the collection in the Tokyo National Museum. So if you're in Tokyo, among the many beautiful works of art to see in the museum there is this very ancient and historically extremely significant Buddha. On the topic of nature deities, we can move now to a kind of the elusive mother goddess figure in the Indian subcontinent. So here we're looking at a mother goddess. In the Hindu faith, the mother goddess is she takes many forms, but it's all the same goddess. She is often depicted as 7 or 8 mother goddesses, so she multiplies herself. And that were installed in side chambers near the entrance to Hindu temples. This is one of the most naturalistic and quite tender and charming examples of such a mother goddess. We see a mother attentively grasps the wrist of her toddler, but her divinity is clearly indicated by her halo or nimbus. Here, the characteristic, exquisite, flowing, volumetric forms of Indian sculpture, the quite strongly curvilinear delineation of the body, the naturalism, standing with one leg now touching the earth and one leg, the weight-bearing leg, and then the non-weight-bearing leg lifted. So here we see a naturalism really being brought to bear in a mother goddess. She's very earthly. She's not a meditative Buddha with her eyes closed in a state of meditation or detachment and transcendence. And so she is earthy, and she appears often, and she is considered mother of all of the gods. So she takes on many forms. So I want you to think about her, 2,500 to 3,000 really 4,000 years earlier, we have this seated mother goddess. And what do you notice about this Indus Valley form? Just look at it. I wish we were all together, because surely the dominant feminine attributes are quite evident. It's this very full round breasts, this tiny pinched waist, and these full hips. So, and these curving locks. And what we see in much later Indian sculpture, both male and female, but especially female, are these absolutely hourglass type of figures with very full round breasts and itsy bitsy little waists and full legs and buttocks. And to emphasize this curving, fluid form of sculpture, but also a deeply feminine articulation of form focused on fecundity and childbearing. So this just reiterates some of the characteristics of Indian sculpture in general. Volumetric form. Volumetric, that means an emphasis on the full form in the round. It's not, sometimes you see sculptures where if you look at it from the side, it's somewhere between a board and a sculpture. It's not a full relief, but it is much flatter, as though the artist decided, oh, this is only going to be viewed from the front, so I'll focus on making the front look three-dimensional, but the sides not so much. Well, in Indian sculpture, we see a real emphasis on a full volumetric form in the round. And in this figure, she's almost turning and inviting us to kind of walk around her and admire her from behind as well. And this is, I'm not sure of the stone, but I believe I might have the type of stone here. No, I think it is probably granite or shift, but I think it's a hard stone of Gupta, the Rajasthan area, and they often used granite. So this mother goddess suffuses the Indian pantheon as a single mother taking many forms. and she can be gentle and tender, or she can be so fierce that her ferocity surpasses any of the male gods. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind always when you think about Indian art and the feminine depictions that we find of goddesses. Now I brought this image in. We're not going to analyze this image too closely itself, but it's here to talk now and introduce you to a very important concept in this class, which is the Hindu or divine triad or triumvirate, which is the three gods responsible for creation, upkeep, and destruction of the world. That is pretty much everything. These are the key gods. They are those, and they are Brahma, creation, Shiva, which is destruction, but can also be a tremendous creative life force as well. Destruction produces creation. The seed has to be destroyed to become a sprout. The sprout is destroyed to become the flower. Death becomes new life. And of course, this is deeply bound up and rendered even more intense when we think about samsara, and this cycle transcends the biological life of an organism. And finally, we have Vishnu, who you are reading about right now as in his incarnate form, in a human form, which we call an avatar in the Bhagavad Gita. So Vishnu is an intercessor and a helper and a preserver of humankind and the world in general. Is a very caretaker kind of figure. And we will look at all three of these gods now and their attributes. That is, we're not going to use this particular silver inlay work. It's difficult to see the details, and I have others that are more would fit the definition of a masterpiece in the sense of the humanities that we are always kind of aligning these classes to. That's more appropriate, but you can go back after we've done our analysis and find attributes in these as well. So I'm going to finish here, and then we will go on to our next lesson where we will look at Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu and their attributes and how to recognize them. So I'll see you back here again soon.